This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to each of our witnesses for being here. We sincerely appreciate it and are looking forward to a good hearing. Let's see if I can get those words in the right order. Before I continue, I do want to note for the record that we received NASA's testimony less than 24 hours in advance, late again. I'm raising this for the record because I gently raised the issue at a previous NASA hearing, and after having received testimony for the next morning. And we gave sufficient notice for this hearing. It is important for us to be able to review the prepared testimony to get ourselves ready for these hearings. So I expect going forward that we will receive NASA's testimony in the 48-hour window so that we can read and review the testimony in advance of each of the hearings. So just want to make sure we put that on the record. And I'll start with my opening statement. As I said in the first hearing of this subcommittee in this session, Mars is the horizon goal, and I want Americans to be the first to set foot on the red planet. It is a goal worthy of this great nation, and NASA's Space Launch System, SLS, Orion Crew Vehicle, and Exploration Ground Systems, EGS, are essential core capabilities for getting us into deep space and onward to Mars. Because I believe in moving human exploration forward beyond low Earth orbit in a safe, sustainable, and affordable way is a goal that we all share and want to achieve. Today, many eyes are on the moon, a stepping stone toward Mars. The administration seeks to send humans there by 2024. 4 years earlier than the president proposed in the initial fiscal year 2020 budget. Can NASA do so as a part of a safe, sustainable, and affordable means of achieving this Mars goal? At this point, there are many questions that remain to be answered. Why did the administration request 16% less than the FY 2019 enacted levels for SLS, Orion, and EGS in its initial request for fiscal year 2020, while also prioritizing deep space exploration near and on the surface of the moon? Why did the administration choose not to request funding in FY 2020 for an exploration upper stage that would give SLS more lift capability to carry cargo to deep space destinations? Why did NASA abruptly reassign its well-respected and long-standing head of Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate at a time when NASA is approaching key milestones for SLS, Orion, and commercial crew, while also planning for a gateway and human landing system, all on very tight timelines? Why is NASA not requiring an uncrewed demonstration of a human landing system? And is this trading sustainability for affordability in a rush to send humans to the moon by 2024? Is a human landing on the moon in 2024 even possible? And if it is possible, what is it going to take in annual funding, management capacity, and technical capability to achieve this goal? I'm pleased that NASA and its industry partners and the exploration system workforce have made significant strides on the SLS and Orion programs in recent months. In July, the Orion program successfully tested and demonstrated the Orion launch abort system. The SLS program is integrating the core stage with the engine section in what will be a major milestone and the beginning of a complete rocket. I'm excited because clear progress increases confidence. However, getting to this point, as we all know, has come with major challenges: flat funding, budget overruns, technical problems, issues with program cost and schedule management, and instances of poor workmanship. The road ahead, integration and testing, isn't likely to be any easier. Challenges with developing programs and new technology aren't surprising, especially when we're asking NASA to push the boundaries of innovation in projects that have never been done before. What is surprising, though, is that recommendations on how to address cost, schedule, and management problems haven't been followed. As we work to reauthorize NASA, there are still more questions that need answers. What is the new rescheduled launch readiness date for the first uncrewed SLS and Orion integrated test flight? How is NASA guarding against schedule pressure given the 2024 lunar landing goal? What are NASA's plans for completing the exploration upper stage, the SLS, Block 1B variant, and the second mobile launch platform that is needed to launch a Block 1B vehicle? I ask these questions because we need to know the near-term status of SLS and Orion and how that affects our overall exploration goals. The House will soon vote on a continuing resolution for FY 2020 for funding, a relatively clean CR with no additional funding for the Moon program. What will this mean for the 2024 date? In the absence of detailed information, a plan, and an estimated budget profile for the Moon program, I can't get to a clear answer. I believe that the members of this subcommittee on both sides of the aisle share the desire for our nation to dream big in our goals for space exploration and scientific discovery, including the goal of sending our astronauts into deep space to explore the Moon, Mars, and other destinations. Doing so will bring our society untold benefits that we can't imagine today, just as global positioning and navigation, communication satellites, medical advancements, the miniaturized camera technology, even in the cell phones that we carry around, and so much more now are used in our day-to-day lives. In closing, we need to right the ship for SLS, Orion, and EGS and set a sustainable course forward. But if we're serious about a human exploration program that ultimately leads to landing humans on Mars, we need to build in sustainability, accountability, transparency, and affordability from the start. We need to learn from our challenges in order to set up a structure and manage our future human spaceflight programs for success. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony. Recognize the ranking member for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to be here, and thank you, witnesses. Looking forward to your testimonies. NASA's long-term goal is laid out consistently in 2005, 2008, 2010, and the 2017 NASA Authorization Acts is to explore the Moon, Mars, and beyond, and stepping stone approach based on available funding. Numerous reports over the last 50 years have all determined that we need at least a 40 to 60 ton launch vehicle, and ideally a 130-ton launch vehicle to conduct any meaningful exploration of deep space. We also need a crew capsule that can operate for extended periods in deep space with sufficient environmental controls and life support systems and in-space propulsion capability and the ability to withstand re-entry from the Moon and from Mars. The Space Launch System, Orion Crew Vehicle, and Exploration Ground Systems are the only systems designed to operate beyond low Earth orbit. They are the tip of the spear of our nation's deep space exploration efforts. SLS and Orion will enable U.S. astronauts to return to the Moon for the first time since Gene Cernan left his daughter's name in the lunar regolith in 1972. As Vice President Pence said in the inaugural meeting of the reestablished National Space Council, we will return American astronauts to the Moon not only to leave behind footprints and flags, but also to build the foundation that we need to send Americans on to Mars and beyond. I wholeheartedly support the administration's call to return to the Moon and its renewed sense of urgency. This committee has received testimony time and time again that the Moon is the appropriate next destination for our space program. Returning to the Moon does not have to mean delaying a mission to Mars. On the contrary, it is the logical step that enables exploration of the Red Planet and beyond. And while I'm excited by the promise of how strategic assets like SLS and Orion will enable Americans to return to the Moon, this committee has a responsibility to conduct oversight to ensure that these programs are successful. All three exploration systems, SLS, Orion, and ground systems, have experienced many delays and cost overruns over the years. Some of the setbacks were caused by administrations that tried to stifle program budgets and even cancel the programs. Some of the issues were caused by unforeseen events like tornadoes and hurricanes, but many of the issues recently were caused by poor execution. As the GAO testimony reports, quote, management and oversight problems are the real drivers behind program cost and schedule growth, unquote. Congress needs to understand where the program is today. What costs, schedule, and performance deliverables can the agency commit to? What is the plan going forward? How will NASA manage future issues to ensure long-term program sustainability? And as I said at the last hearing on these programs, we aren't out of the woods yet, but we can now see the edge of the forest at least. Significant progress has been made, but not as much as we had hoped. We must have that sense of urgency. In order to meet our nation's space exploration goals, it will take focus and discipline, continuity of effort to go forward. The administration and the Congress must not only provide leadership and direction, but we must also appropriately fund and oversee these programs. NASA must develop future exploration architectures that use the capabilities of SLS and Orion to their full potential rather than setting them up for failure. Similarly, NASA and the contractors must execute, and failure to do so could have dire consequences for the whole program, and there will be no one else to blame. The administration has demonstrated its renewed support. Congress consistently funds the program at healthy levels. It is time for NASA and the contractors to deliver. And I'm very thankful that our witnesses are here today to help us better understand where we are in this program and how we plan to move forward. And I look forward to your testimony. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Johnson, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, and good morning, and welcome to our witnesses, and thanks to all of the subcommittee members who are present. I want to thank you, Chairwoman Horn and Ranking Member, for today's hearing on NASA's Space Launch System, the Orion crewed vehicle, the exploration ground systems, which are essential elements of the nation's human exploration program. I want to echo Chairwoman Horn's comment about the lateness of NASA's testimony. NASA was provided ample advance notice of this hearing and more than sufficient time to prepare testimony and have it reviewed by OMB or whomever else looks over NASA's testimony these days. The fact that this testimony is overdue is not only frustrating, it leaves members little opportunity to consider NASA's testimony in advance of the hearing. If NASA and the administration can't meet simple hearing deadlines, it doesn't inspire great confidence in their ability to meet the much harder deadline of landing astronauts on the moon by 2024. Turning to the focus of this hearing, we are going to need SLS, Orion, and the associated ground systems as we are going to send our astronauts to the worlds beyond our own, whether it's the moon or Mars or other destinations. We need to be sure they are developed and efficiently and are well managed. I certainly want this nation to explore deep space with humans once again, and I think it is a sentiment shared by members on both sides of the aisle. However, having recently reflected on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, it's clear that we need to do it right, safely, sustainably, and affordably. That's not an easy task. The Apollo program was aggressive and bold, but it also featured extensive testing, the efforts of hundreds of thousands of dedicated civil servants and contractors, relative budgetary stability, and an effective organizational structure led by experienced engineers and program managers. It also had the benefit of an extensive series of Mercury and Gemini precursor missions that helped mature the design and operational techniques used in the Apollo program. As I look at the few details that are available on the Trump administration's 2024 moon landing initiative, the contrast with Apollo is striking and troubling. It has been 47 years since we sent astronauts beyond low-level orbit. It has been almost a decade since an American spacecraft and astronauts into the space at all. Yet the administration's plan requires astronauts to attempt a lunar landing on only the second crewed flight beyond low Earth orbit, after what by then will have been 50-year hiatus, with no real plans for prior crewed preparatory flights in low Earth orbit. And based on the information available to date, that landing attempt could also be the first flight of the lunar landing and ascent vehicles and transfer vehicles. That is, the schedule doesn't appear to baseline any test flights prior to the first crewed lunar landing attempt. That first lunar landing attempt will also be the first crewed visit to the Gateway. There will be no prior crewed visits to the Gateway to check it out before using it to initiate the lunar landing attempt. And under current plans, it looks like the administration is proposing to have the set of 3 lunar landing system vehicles that do not yet exist, either in government or in private sector, be provided for NASA's use under a fixed-price commercially provided service. That is, the government would not own them or have any significant oversight of their development. And of all this would have to happen by 2024. Moreover, it has now been more than 2 months since the head of NASA Human Exploration and Operations Directorate was removed from his position with no permanent replacement yet identified, even though that position is critical to the success of NASA's exploration and ISS programs. And we have been told not to expect a cost estimate of our budget plan for the President's Moon program before next year. I could go on, but I hope that my point is clear. Rhetoric about American leadership in space and advancing the role of women in space flight is all well and good, but it is not a substitute for a well-planned, well-managed, well-funded, and well-executed exploration program. To date, Congress has not been given a credible basis for believing that the President's Moon 2024 program satisfies any of those criteria. In short, if Congress is to support such a program, the administration is going to have to do a lot more to provide such evidence. I again want to welcome all of our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee and fellow Oklahoman, Mr. Lucas, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moon landing this summer, it was a great reminder of the great things that we can achieve with perseverance, technical excellence, and a pioneering spirit. The Trump administration has harnessed this spirit of discovery and focused our human space exploration efforts. By staying the course on programs like Space Launch System, Orion, Exploration Ground Systems, the administration is ensuring that our national goals to explore the moon, Mars, and beyond will be achieved. This support is backed up by this administration with its robust funding request. Year after year, the Trump administration has proposed increased funding for NASA exploration systems, only to have Congress appropriate even more than the administration requested. This year, the administration took the extraordinary step of amending its budget by requesting an additional $1.6 billion to accelerate our return to the moon by 2024. This will serve as a down payment on the systems necessary to enable this goal. The primary elements are already well under development. The Space Launch System, Orion Crew Capsule, and the Exploration Ground Systems will serve as the foundation for future exploration of the Moon and Mars. Congress has already provided consistent funding for the advanced capacities like the Exploration Upper Stage and additional mobile launch platforms. These will accelerate the development of a 130-ton launch vehicle, which is optimum for deep space exploration. This steady funding is a blessing, and yes, a curse. Too often programs become complacent when funding is taken for granted. Congress and NASA need to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars and ensure these programs stay focused, on schedule, and within cost. But adequately funding SLS, Orion, and ground systems are only part of what is needed for a lunar exploration. NASA also needs to develop a human lander and associated support systems. NASA's budget request already plants the seeds for technologies that will be necessary, but it is scheduled to deliver a more detailed plan with their fiscal year 2021 budget proposal. I look forward to reviewing that upcoming request. Nearly 30 years ago, Western Oklahoma's favorite son, General Tom Stafford, delivered a report entitled America at the Threshold. My friends, we are once again at the threshold, and our actions will determine our future space leadership. But unlike 30 years ago, we have hardware ready to be delivered, an administration with a sense of urgency, and a Congress that I believe is on board. We also have new challenges to our leadership in space. Last year, China conducted the most launches in the world. They have already launched crewed missions and a temporary space station. They landed a rover on the far side of the moon, a first for humanity, and plan to land a crew on the moon in coming years. They are also seeking international partnerships. We have a responsibility to ensure that America remains the world leader in space exploration, that humanity's push into deep space is led by freedom and liberty rather than communism. As our nation once again stood at the threshold of deep space, it is up to Congress to up to NASA to develop a plan made on SLS, Orion, and ground systems. We cannot afford to cede our leadership in space exploration. I trust, I believe, I have confidence that we can all work together to achieve our shared goals. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ranking. 200 days in space. He went on to serve as a director of Johnson Space Center's Flight Crew Operations Directorate. And previously, he was a member of the standing review boards for the ISS, Space Shuttle, and the Constellation Program, and was vice president of astronaut safety and mission assurance at Space Exploration Technologies. Mr. Bowersox also served as the chair of NASA's Advisory Council's Human Exploration and Operations Committee. Mr. Bowersox received a degree in aerospace engineering from the United States Naval Academy and holds the rank of captain in the United States Navy. Mr. Bowersox was also inducted into the Astronaut Hall of Fame in 2010. Welcome, Mr. Bowersox. We're glad that you're with us today. Our second witness is Miss Cristina Chaplain. Ms. Chaplain serves currently as a director in the Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO. She has responsibility for GAO assessments of NASA, military space programs, and the Missile Defense Agency. She has recently led reviews on the Space Launch System, the Orion Crew Capsule, the James Webb Telescope, commercial cargo and crew systems, the Global Positioning System, cyber protection for weapons, and space leadership. Ms. Chaplain has been with the GAO for 28 years, and prior to her current position, she worked with GAO's financial management and information technology teams. She received a bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, in international relations from Boston University, and a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Welcome, Ms. Chaplain. Our final and third witness today is Mr. Doug Cooke, an aerospace consultant with over 46 years' experience in human spaceflight programs. Mr. Cooke provides expertise on company and program strategies, program management, space policy, proposal development, strategic planning, and technical matters. Mr. Cooke previously served as the Associate Administrator for Exploration Systems Mission Directorate at NASA. While at NASA, Mr. Cooke was responsible for leading efforts to adopt the current vehicle designs for SLS and Orion. Mr. Cooke was also the Deputy Director of Exploration Systems Mission Directorate and previously spent over 30 years at Johnson Space Center in a variety of management and engineering positions. He received a bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, in aerospace engineering from Texas A&M University. Welcome, Mr. Cooke. As our witnesses, you should all know that you'll each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you've completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will then have 5 minutes to question the panel. And we will start today with Mr. Bowersox.
Hey, good morning. It's great to be here with you today, representing the men and women who serve in NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate. It's an honor for me to serve as the acting associate administrator for our directorate, where our team works every day to move humanity's presidents out into the solar system and gathers knowledge that makes lives better here on Earth. The main topics of the hearing today are our exploration systems development programs, the Orion spacecraft, the Space Launch System, and the exploration ground systems required to prepare and launch the SLS with Orion. Since I joined NASA as the Deputy Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations in February of this year, I've been steadily impressed by the progress on all three of these programs. The first core stage of the Space Launch System is within months of completion at the Michoud Assembly Facility in Florida. The Orion vehicle for the first uncrewed flight of Orion around the moon is at Kennedy Space Center, perched on top of its European-built service module and just about ready to be shipped for testing at the Plum Brook Station Vacuum Facility in Cleveland. And the exploration ground systems in Florida are undergoing some of their final tests in preparation for stacking of the solid rocket boosters, core stage, interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the Orion spacecraft, and its launch abort system for the first Artemis mission. During the design, development, test, and assembly of all the parts I just mentioned, the programs have had their share of issues. Some of the issues were first-time build issues, some of the issues were due to changes in production processes, and some were issues we could have predicted. Many of those issues added time and cost onto the effort to build these systems. Despite these difficulties, the team has persisted, and we're getting closer every day to the launching of Artemis 1. While it's still early to declare a precise date when we'll attempt to launch the first Artemis mission, my team and I are intent on maintaining the proper balance among holding schedule, understanding the cost, and learning what we need to be sure our exploration systems are ready for the crews of subsequent Artemis missions to fly to the moon, return to Earth, and share their stories with the rest of us. This year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first landing of humans on the moon. It's thrilling to know that we're so close to sending humans to the moon again, and that all of us here are part of that effort. I look forward to answering your questions today and sharing more about our development of SLS, Orion, and the ground systems for deep space exploration.
Thank you, Mr. Bowersox. Ms. Chaplain, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Horn, Ranking Member Babin, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, thank you for inviting me today to discuss the Space Launch System, Orion Crew Capsule, and supporting ground systems. We last reported on the status of these programs in June 2019, and I recognize there's been some noteworthy progress since our work. The successful test of Orion's launch abort system is one example. However, we've been auditing these programs for about 5 years and have consistently raised concerns about management. I'd like to highlight 3 concerns that remain today. First, the schedule has always been too optimistic. Before a baseline was set, it was envisioned the first launch of SLS would occur in December 2017. NASA appropriately recognized that date was unrealistic when it committed to a date for Congress, but that November 2018 baseline date was also too optimistic. NASA reset that date to no later than June 2020, and within a year, we found it was unlikely that this date could be met. NASA is once again reviewing its launch dates at this time. Second, costs have not been transparent. For 5 years, we've only had cost estimates for the first flight of SLS and the second flight of Orion. We do not know what these programs will cost over time or what each launch will cost. We do not have ranges of what costs would be for certain types of missions. Most recently, we found that updates to the estimate for SLS and Orion were underreporting costs. For example, NASA moved hundreds of millions of dollars of costs away from the SLS estimate because it believed they were tied more to future missions, but it did not change the baseline cost estimate. This had the effect of distorting cost growth. Moreover, without baselines for future costs, there's no way to account for the costs that were shifted out. In other words, we cannot easily track what's being spent right now on the future. NASA is also reviewing its cost estimates at this time. We do not know if the next estimates will cover future costs. Third, programs have been consistently run with low levels of cost and schedule reserves. Human spaceflight programs face a wide range of inherent technical design and engineering risks. Many problems that will be encountered are not always easy to anticipate. The best way to prepare for these risks is to set aside cost and schedule reserves. NASA has done so for other major projects, which has contributed to better acquisition performance. Reserves are not a panacea. We still see that even programs with healthy reserves, such as the James Webb Telescope, can still experience considerable cost and schedule growth. But not providing reserves exacerbates an already risky situation. At the same time, it's important to recognize that there are external factors, such as funding requests or decisions that may not match development needs, that help influence this practice. We have other concerns about these programs as well. For example, contracts were not definitized for many months, which limited NASA's ability to manage contractor performance. When performance was not good, contractors still received award fees. Quality and workmanship problems contributed to many months of rework and delay. It's unrealistic to think that cost and schedule growth can be prevented altogether, but better management practice can help reduce the impacts of problems that arise. My statement details practices that can be adopted. I'd like to emphasize a few key ones. First, in starting new efforts, it's important to maximize competition and have a long-term strategy or vision that can help guide technology design and requirements decisions. Congress and the administration need to be key players in the long-term strategy development. In managing programs, contracts need to be structured to provide the right incentives at the right times, and contractor oversight needs to be optimized. This can be done by breaking large contracts into smaller pieces, using earned value management analyses to track performance, and having insight into quality management practices, as well as rewarding good performance and not rewarding poor performance. Lastly, to meet the challenge of going to the moon by 2024, it may be necessary for NASA to take on more schedule risk and to conduct many activities concurrently. Having backup plans will be key to managing these risks, as well as establishing good configuration management practices, detailed architectures to help guide and manage decisions, and candid reporting to Congress, especially as problems occur. This concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Chaplain. Mr. Cooke.
Thank you, Chairwoman Horn, Ranking Member Babin, Chairwoman Johnson, and Ranking Member Lucas. Thank you also the members of the committee for this opportunity to address the current state of deep space exploration. It is an endeavor I have devoted much of my life and career to. I truly appreciate your interest. I also thank the people at NASA and in industry who work very hard every day to make these programs happen and successful. I defer to Ken Bowersox for specifics of the program. I will focus on how SLS and Orion came into being for context and how they're being used. What I consider to be the most straightforward approach to a near-term human lunar landing and management solutions from my experience in the Space Shuttle, Space Station, and exploration programs, given concerns in recent GAO reports and my own observations. There is much more extensive detail on all of this in my written testimony. The Space Launch System, Orion, and ground systems were designed based on goals, objectives, requirements, and constraints. At the highest level, space programs are guided by space policy from administrations in Congress, which initiate the programs that enhance our national leadership, commerce, scientific knowledge, international relationships, and more. These objectives drive what capabilities and missions are needed. They lead to space and surface systems that will have to be transported. For 30 years, human missions to the moon and Mars have been envisioned in policy. Over this period, I have been part of or led much of the study and planning that has been done. All studies have led to the requirement for a capsule and a heavy lift vehicle as the most critical elements in a human exploration architecture. A blunt-shaped entry capsule with high-temperature materials is required for high velocities from the lunar and Mars distances. As an example, the space shuttle could not have survived. A heavy lift vehicle on the order of 100 to 130 metric tons or more with a large payload volume is needed for the large heavy elements. Anything less over-constrains landers and habitats. The specific decision process and component choices for SLS are in my written testimony. The fewer launches and critical operations per mission, the higher the probability of mission success. Documentaries of Apollo 11 during the 50th anniversary reminded me about how much anxious anticipation you have as each critical flight operation occurs, knowing that failure can be mission-ending or life-threatening. It's also true in robotic missions. Recall the JPL Curiosity mission in the 7 Minutes of Terror, as the team awaited for the signal of the Mars landing. NASA's current approach to the first lunar landing has numerous launches, one SLS carrying Orion and several more expended commercial launch vehicles with 8 new flight elements, including gateway elements. SLS is not used for the lander or ascent vehicles, and the lander even has to be fueled at the gateway. Therefore, SLS is not being used for what it was designed to do other than carry Orion. The approach has about 17 of these critical mission operations that have to go right for this first moon mission to succeed. Based on past experience, it also seems high risk for 8 new procurements and developments to succeed by the administration's mandated 2024 landing date. If NASA focuses on the investment in the ongoing SLS with the EUS, Orion, and ground system developments, there is a better chance of making an earlier date. NASA should pursue an SLS payload shroud to get to 100-plus metric ton launch capability with the EUS. Then I believe a crew and less constrained lander can be launched to the moon with 2 SLS launches. NASA can focus on new development energy on an integrated lander and surface spacesuit. That's still a lot to accomplish in new developments. The gateway can be deferred until later, and there will be opportunities for commercial vehicles. I recognize that there have been concerns and issues with these programs that the GAO and others have reported. There are delays. Based on my observations and reading the GAO reports, I believe a strong systems engineering and integration effort across the program and a prime integration contractor are needed to improve reporting and to work problems and interfaces expeditiously between program elements. It can maintain accurate integrated schedule tied to budget. It can provide the oversight where needed. This is what was done on the space station program between Space Station Freedom and International Space Station programs. It was needed. These programs now are 24/7. At this point, there needs to be urgency to get them done. This is a time to bear down on these programs with strong leadership and the organizational structure to take advantage of investments we are making and achieve the earliest possible landing date with capabilities that lead to a sustainable exploration program. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooke. We'll now begin with questions. As you could tell, we have many questions. We're all on the same page, I think, clearly on both sides of the aisle here about supporting a strong exploration program and the need to ensure that we do it right and sustainably. So I'm going to start with a few questions, Mr. Bowersox, for you. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and we'll go through them pretty quickly, and then we'll come to some more. So first question, when will NASA determine a new launch readiness date for EM1, and what are the risks of continuing to delay announcement of a new launch date?
Well, right after naming a permanent associate administrator, we expect within a month or two that person would have time to come up with a date that they can be ready to commit to Congress on. Now, I would like to assure you, we've got a schedule we're working internally, but it's what we call a manage-to schedule, right? It's a best-case schedule. The reason we want to give a new person a chance to take a look at what we're thinking about is there are some uncertainties in there that before they commit to it, they should be able to exercise their judgment on the date.
So to sum it up, not until a new administrator is named.
That's the short answer. Yes.
Okay. Why haven't Orion and SLS contracts for vehicles beyond EM2 been definitized, and when will they be definitized? What strategy are you using to incentivize contractor performance in these contracts?
Well, it's critical to get those contracts in place for Artemis 3. So we're working that very hard. It's one of our top priorities right now. And we expect to have the Orion contract in place within a month or so, very, very soon, more like a year probably for the SLS contract.
Okay. Did you carry out, and this is, I think, a very important question in some of the realignments, did you carry out an assessment of the costs, risk, and safety of using a more capable SLS Block 1B versus multiple commercial launches to a stage a lunar landing to Mr. Cooke's point? This is just a yes or no. Was there an analysis conducted?
Yes, we've considered that.
Okay, so in the analysis, the committee would very much like to see that analysis, and if you can provide that to us, please. So when do you
And I
plan?
should correct, I mean, we have considered it. I have not seen an analysis. But
Okay.
I'll see what we've got and tell you that.
Okay, so it has been considered, but there may not be a full written analysis
Yeah,
of that.
what we're most worried about is having enough cores to do that in time for a 2024 landing.
Okay.
You know, with our production issues.
Okay. And when do you plan to use the EUS on an SLS launch, and what is NASA doing to implement that plan?
Right now, we're looking at where we can use EUS. At this point, the earliest we would probably be able to use it is around Artemis 4, but we need to work that internally with our budget estimates. Right now, our current plan would be to go ahead without EUS. That's what's in our official President's budget submission. However, Congress has been very helpful in providing funding for EUS, and so the earliest we would be likely to use it is Artemis 4.
Okay. I think any information that you have, we'd like to see an analysis of the decision metrics there. So if you can provide that to us as soon as possible, that would be great.
All right, and just to restate what our administrator has said, we want EUS. It would be very helpful in our architecture, and we understand that.
Okay. Ms. Chaplain, you raised some very important points, and in my opening statement, noted that we have seen some serious challenges in the SLS, Orion, and EGS during the development. And while we need to right the ship and fix current problems, we're also working on NASA reauthorization. And so looking forward, I have a couple of questions for you. Could you summarize, I'll just give you a few and let you answer at once because I think these go together. Could you summarize some of the lessons learned that can be applied to future programs? And what specifically can this committee and Congress do to ensure that these actions are taken? Finally, is it a matter of oversight, or are there areas that need to be addressed in the authorization to set up the programs for success as we address the issues that we've experienced moving forward?
I think much of what has been done is not really, that should be done is not something you can legislate. They're really just basic good practices that NASA should be following. And I think at various times they've been called on to do that. When we look at the problems from like a higher level perspective, we see a couple themes that I'll go through, and I think it'll help you see where we need to target things going forward. One thing is they've made it very difficult to understand where money's going in these programs and what's being spent in the future. There has been some language congressionally out there to make sure that happens, to make sure we get the right baselines for costly elements of the programs, as well as future flights, and as well as cost estimates for missions, and to just have better tracking of costs within the program over time. Also, the programs have not always used the management tools that they have available to them. That talks about things like award fees, really exercising them to not reward good performance and incentivize performance when it is good. That's what I meant. And then other kinds of tools like even standing review boards and independent assessments, they tend to give NASA a range of estimates, high, low, where things could go. NASA tends to take the low estimates, and that's sort of goes to that overall theme of optimistic estimating and hoping everything's going to go right. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, just following best practices when you develop cost estimates, when you lay the groundwork for programs. There's a lot that could be done there. There were efforts to adopt some very good practices like joint confidence level for these programs, but I think even in doing that, there's things within those methodologies that could be improved.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cooke, I'll have questions for you later, but I want to make sure everybody gets the chance. So, Mr. Babin, you're recognized.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Mr. Cooke, your testimony references numerous studies that all conclude that the optimal lunar exploration mission architecture features 2 SLS launches. Since it decreases the number of launches necessary, thereby increasing mission success, and it allows for a wider lander with a lower center of gravity that is more stable when landing. NASA, however, is pursuing a plan that requires multiple launches on less capable rockets, more in-space docking, and a narrower lander. Based on decades of trade studies, does this make any sense to you, and is NASA relying on commercial launch vehicles because they don't believe that they will have 2 SLSs available by 2024?
My short answer is no, it doesn't make sense to me. When you divide up the lander, there's an ascent vehicle and descent vehicle. It even has to be fueled at the gateway by launching on smaller vehicles. It constrains the payload diameter as well, so it limits the size of the lander. These things, for one, it can cause the lander to get taller, which then makes it less stable on a slope on a lunar surface. Right. But it also limits what you can fly on it. Right now, the requirements look to be based on entirely on an ascent vehicle for the crew. However, if you do the work to lay out the long-term architecture and what you're actually going to achieve on the moon, it'll have to transport other things like a habitat, potentially, or rovers, and without those requirements, and when ending up with a small lander, you may not be able to build the capability that you need to be sustainable.
Okay, thank you. And also, Mr. Cooke, the Orion crew vehicle and the European service module are less capable than the Apollo command module and service module because the European service module is based on the automated transfer vehicle that provided cargo to the ISS. This led NASA to propose a transfer vehicle in their concept of operations for a moon landing. The NASA Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel recently stated that the ESM propulsion system continues to raise issues that affect both safety and schedule. Why doesn't NASA just ensure that the European service module meets the requirement of enabling a crewed lunar landing rather than starting an entirely new development?
The service module is obviously key to the architecture in terms of getting the crew where they need to go. The distribution of where propulsion goes in the fuel needs to be worked out. I believe NASA needs to really own the lunar landing and get the architecture together to do it most effectively.
Okay. And then, Mr. Bowersox, what does NASA need to do regarding spacesuits to enable a crewed landing in 2024? Does NASA plan to change the plans that they laid out in the spacesuit plan delivered to Congress a few years ago?
Well, our current plan is to have the suit developed at the Johnson Space Center. There's been a lot of work that's been going on there for years and years since I was an astronaut. And we're going to build on that work to have JSC manage a program and develop a lunar suit for us.
Okay, great. And then one other question for you. Recently, we heard of potential issues with the delivery of the Orion spacecraft to Plumbrook for testing. Apparently, the margins for the Super Guppy, the airplane that is planned to transport the spacecraft, could be insufficient to handle a potential emergency landing based on the weight of Orion and the container that it's shipped in. What is the status of this review? And will Orion make it to Plumbrook on schedule? And will NASA have to use the Pegasus barge and go through the St. Lawrence Seaway to be potentially iced in over the wintertime? And if so, would this impact the use of the Pegasus barge for transporting the core stage to Stennis this winter? I know that's several questions wrapped up, but if you can answer those, I'm running out of time.
So you sort of hit all the issues and all everything we're working. But the bottom line is the latest news is we're very hopeful that the Guppy is going to work out. Our most likely backup options would be other aircraft options. For example, the Beluga aircraft that they have over in Europe right now would require some extra time, but we still think we'd be ready for the launch of Artemis 1 that we're sort of forecasting.
Okay, so we don't have to deal with ice, an iced-in St. Lawrence
No,
Seaway then, huh?
no, sir. We were all worried about that too, but we think we're going to be okay.
All right, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. The chair recognizes Mr. Chris for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our panelists for being with us today. Mr. Bowersox, I'm pleased that NASA has moved forward with the award of the Mobile Launcher 2 contract this summer. Can you provide an update on the status of the second mobile launcher and discuss how this additional capability at the Kennedy Space Center will support the goal of returning humans to the surface of the moon by 2024?
Yes, sir. We expect to start construction on the second mobile launcher late this year, and that program's going pretty well. There's lots of lessons learned from the construction of the first mobile launcher that we're building on, and that's going to enable us to use an SLS Block 1B or Block 2 later with an exploration upper stage.
Mr. Cooke, do you have anything to add to that?
I fully support the moving ahead on the ML2. It's important for what we need to get to the larger SLS vehicle, and it will be important for our lunar exploration.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bowersox, can you discuss the NASA plan for Orion and the Space Launch System, also known as SLS, after returning humans to the surface of the moon for 2024?
The first 3 missions we expect to launch on roughly 2-year centers, and then after that we'd like to go to 1 launch every year for the SLS with an Orion, and that would be our cadence for all the lunar missions.
Specifically, will SLS be used to transport segments of the lunar gateway or lunar orbit?
If we get EUS in future budgets, we would be able to take some elements of gateway or potentially logistics elements out to lunar orbit with the Orion vehicle.
Can you discuss how SLS and Orion will be modified and utilized for travel to Mars?
Well, one of the things I like about our current plan is that we wouldn't need to do much modification for SLS or Orion to go to Mars. We'd like to have the cargo version of SLS ready for Mars so we can transport the large diameter heat shields we think will be required to enter Mars. But that's one of the good things about our architecture is it's not just the moon, it's also Mars, it's both.
Does NASA have a plan or a time frame for SLS and Orion to get humans to Mars, or if not, is such a plan in development?
That plan is in development, and we're in very detailed discussions inside the agency.
Again, Mr. Cooke, would you like to also comment on the future of SLS and Orion?
The future of SLS and Orion is based on both lunar and Mars exploration. When we did the design back in, actually the final design, getting to the current concept of SLS was in 2011. They were designed for Moon and Mars missions. That was the criteria.
Mr. Bowersox, I've always been fascinated by the potential for life to exist elsewhere in our universe. I was intrigued by the news last week that water vapor was found in the atmosphere of an Earth-like exoplanet. Can you discuss how SLS and Orion might help contribute to future exploration of the universe and a search for life, whether it be launching larger, more powerful telescopes or through future deep space exploration, even beyond Mars?
Well, to me, that's one of the most exciting things about having a capability like the Space Launch System, is we don't know exactly what we'll do with it yet. But as we develop it, as we generate the ability to make cores more predictably, I think we'll have lots of opportunities to do the types of things you're talking about.
Great. Mr. Cooke, in your testimony, you write that, quote, exploration capabilities should be made available for commercial and other interests to further the utilization of space. I assume that also includes academic interests, perhaps to support the search for life elsewhere. Could you elaborate on your point?
The value in having a vehicle like SLS fully developed with the full lift capability and not just lift capability, but what's important is the volume of the payloads and the diameter that is allowed on the top of the core stage. This allows for larger aperture telescopes. For instance, the James Webb Telescope, which I'm looking forward to see fly, has to be deployed. You can get to larger, simpler spacecraft with that capability. And the lift capability can allow you to actually get places quicker with upper stages that will accelerate and get to the outer planets, and so it provides a lot of opportunity that's fully yet to be worked out.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. Chair recognizes Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bowersox, let's just cut to the chase. If NASA does not receive the additional $1.6 billion for fiscal year 2020, or some anomaly in the continuing resolution to fund things, will it be able to achieve a crewed lunar landing in 2024? How important is this money?
The amendment and the ability to spend that money if we have a continuing resolution is critical to getting to the lunar surface in 2024. We need it to start our human landing system program.
So basically, it blows a big hole in the program if we are not properly funding you.
Well, we wouldn't give
Makes
up,
it more complicated.
but
How
it
about
makes
that?
it much, much harder. Yes, sir.
Mr. Cooke, let's go back to, again, the 20,000-foot view, as we would say in western Oklahoma. How does exploration of the moon enable us to explore Mars? Please.
The exploration of the moon does help in a lot of ways. In terms of getting to critical operations on another planetary body that we haven't done in 50 years. There are hostile environments that have to be encountered at both places that you have to learn to design for. Many of the systems that will be designed will evolve to Mars systems, if not be used as is. But in going to Mars, the trips are so much longer that reliability is
Days versus months and years.
Yes, 500 to 1,000-day missions. Everything has to be very reliable because you're sending a crew and you want to return them safely. So getting to reliable systems can be proved out in an operational program like the lunar program. You tend to spend the effort on the technology you need in an ongoing program. A lot of times programs can get defunded or the money taken to do other things. But if you're on a direct path and have clear goals, then you know that you have to get it done. So it's a forcing function too.
Mr. Bowersox, let's touch on this again. What is the earliest that Artemis 1 could be launched, and what's the limiting factor?
The earliest that we could launch Artemis 1 at this point is roughly at the end of next year. We've got to get it out of the factory, which we think will happen at the end of this year. We have at best 5 to 6 months for testing and another 5 to 6 months of processing at the Cape before we could launch. And then if you start throwing in weather delays, any potential technical problems, anything that we have to fix after we fire the engines, that adds on extra time, and it's just hard to say exactly what will happen until we get there.
But at this stage, you have a certain amount of time built in the concept of going at the end of 2020, correct?
Yes, sir. We've got some likely delays that are based on previous programs and previous performance, but there's lots of judgment involved in interpreting those numbers.
Mr. Cooke, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel often cites the launch rate of SLS as a concern. What's the maximum number of times SLS could launch in a year? And what would those limiting factors be when we're up and going?
My understanding that the current rate is going to be 2 a year. I don't know the limit on what they are. Ken can probably speak to that, but I am concerned about the rate because when we start going to Mars, you're going to have to go more than twice a year to get assembled the vehicles that you have. It'll take on the order of 6 or more SLS launches at full capability to send a crew to Mars. So they can't wait for however many years that is. So it's important to get the rate up.
Speaking of that, Mr. Bowersox, Henry Ford demonstrated a century ago that if you move enough product down the assembly line, cost will come down, efficiencies will increase. So after the initial development of SLS and Orion, NASA will transition to operation contracts for the procurement. What cost reductions does NASA expect to see in that next generation of contract?
Well, we're working those contracts now, so I don't really want to get into specifics, but we expect to see some reduction and some improvement in the rate with which we can produce the cores at the Michoud Assembly Facility.
And we'll need those savings to achieve that greater production rate. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. The chair recognizes Ms. Hill.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I have a couple questions. Mr. Bowersox, what is the current status of the prime contracts for the SLS core stages and Orion crew capsules beyond Artemis 2?
The contracts are in negotiation. We're closer on getting the actual contract signed for Orion for Artemis 3 and beyond. We expect that fairly soon and expect on the order of a year before we'll see the core stage contract work. Now, in the meantime, in order to purchase long lead items so we don't have delays, we work on undefinitized contract actions, letter contracts to buy long lead parts. And there's some risk in doing that contract risk, but that's what we're doing.
Do you think NASA will be transitioning those procurements to fixed price contracts from cost plus contracts?
What we've been trying to do is for each of the contracts transition from cost plus to fixed price. Sometimes it happens during the contract.
Okay. And Ms. Chaplain and Mr. Cooke, can you each comment on NASA's decisions on when to use cost plus versus fixed price contracts for SLS and Orion procurement?
I would say generally for space programs, when you transition to the phase where you are producing higher numbers of whatever spacecraft there is, that's your opportunity to really get into the fixed price contracting. When you're in the earlier stages, there's a lot of uncertainties about what you're doing. The government does need to take on more risk at those stages unless they have plenty of contractors willing to sign up for prices that might not be well understood.
I totally agree with with Ms. Chaplain.
Great.
One aspect of this, though, is in getting to fixed price on, say, on the SLS is it's not just the core stage; it's boosters, it's engines, and NASA is currently the integrator. If you want to get to a fixed price on a launch vehicle, it would seem to me that it would be better to have that combined under a prime contract that then has control, where the owner of the prime contract has control of all the processes and can actually bring some of these efficiencies to bear.
That makes sense. And then, Mr. Bowersox, the GAO reported in its assessment in June 2019 of the Human Exploration Systems programs that because both SLS and Orion cost and schedule have exceeded the contract values, NASA plans to renegotiate the Boeing contract for the first two SLS core stages and the exploration upper stage and modify the cost and period of performance aspects of the contract with Lockheed Martin for the first Orion crew capsules. So can you talk about the current status of those updates? I know that you said things are underway.
That it's in process, and we'll talk about all that when we have a named associate administrator.
Great. And can you just say that is NASA modifying the award fee and incentive structure in the renegotiated contracts?
One of the things we're looking at for everything we're doing is how we're handling incentives. We want to incentivize the performance that we desire from our contractors. And I mean, I think we can all agree we're not seeing the performance we want, and so we should be looking at those.
Great. And in that same assessment, it showed that the prior work showed that the integration and testing phase of development often reveals unforeseen challenges leading to cost growth and schedule delays. Anything you want to add to why that is?
Well, the first time you try anything, it's harder. And we are seeing a lot of improvements the second time we do things, the second Orion build, the second core stage build. There's great progress there. And so we have we have a great chance to do better on 3, 4, 5 in each of the production lines.
So given those, how it tends to be unforeseen things that come up, how much cost and schedule margins or reserve would you recommend for SLS and Orion heading into this integration and testing phase?
Well, at this point, we'll take as much extra reserve as we can get, right? But we don't think we need to ask for a lot more than what we put in the budget at this point. And in the next phase, we should be more predictable. It's the new programs where we really want to be thinking about reserves so that we have flexibility. Yes, ma'am.
And Ms. Chaplain, what are the top risks to cost and schedule that you see for SLS and Orion integration and testing?
So I still see a lot of risk ahead. It'll be a different type of risk because you're putting things together, shaking them up and down, testing them, firing them, and all those activities tend to reveal problems that need to be fixed that could cause a bit of rework. You might have to go back in the vehicles, reopen them, and adjust components. If you look at the James Webb program, we saw substantial delays, substantial problems come up in integration and testing. They might be focused on a very small screw, a valve, things like that, but they can cause a lot of delay.
Great. Thank you all so much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Brooks.
Thank you. I've got an article in front of me entitled "Getting Back to the Moon Requires Speed and Simplicity," and it purports to be by Doug Cooke, opinion contributor, and it goes on to say Doug Cooke is a former NASA associate administrator. I just want to make sure that's the same Doug Cooke who's before us today.
Yes, sir.
All right. Let me quote from it in 3 different places. Quote, "Apparently under pressure from commercial launch providers who need additional launches to fill their manifests, NASA is being directed to break the lunar lander into multiple pieces so that these can fit on less powerful commercial launchers, increasing risk and constraining the architecture," end quote. Second quote, "NASA's current approach requires 8 new developments," interjection by me, versus 3 with Apollo, 8 to 3. Resuming the quote, 8 launches versus 1 with Apollo, and approximately 17 mission-critical operations versus 7 with Apollo to achieve the Artemis goals by 2024, end quote. And then finally, quote, "If you assume each event has a 98% probability of success, the likelihood of mission success is 80% for this Apollo-like approach. In comparison, the likelihood of mission success for NASA's current approach is 51%. Not taking into account the launch vehicle maturity risk, NASA can significantly increase speed, simplicity, cost, and probability of mission success by deferring gateway, leveraging SLS, and reducing critical mission operations," end quote. Now, if I were an astronaut, I'd be concerned about these kinds of comments from a former NASA associate administrator. And they appear to suggest that profit motive, i.e. the desire of some individuals for personal gain, may be driving NASA decision-making at much greater risk to our astronauts. So I'd like to have Mr. Cooke, if you would, expound on that, leaving enough time for Mr. Bowersox to reply.
I think that the pressure to get to commercial capabilities and drive that objective is causing us to do things that are higher risk. And going to this many developments from scratch, by the way, starting now, trying to get to 2024, with that many critical mission events, the probabilities are that. And if you assume 0.98, 0.98 is arbitrary, and some of the numbers would be higher, some would be lower, but it's illustrative of the complexity that's been bought into versus what could be done with a more simple approach.
Mr. Bowersox, could you please give us your view on these comments?
Yes, sir. First, nobody's driving us. I mean, we actually came to these conclusions on our own. And a big driver is to have flexibility. We want to have multiple options. We don't want to rely just on one system. We'd like to have other systems. And what we're trying to build on is some of the success we've experienced in having flexibility with our commercial cargo vehicles for station. Having multiple providers, multiple options there has been really useful. When one has a problem, we can go to the other provider. And so we want to take advantage of some of that learning and move it into this other program to help us get to the moon and on to Mars.
Well, if I could interject for a moment, do you concur with Mr. Cooke's belief that the Apollo method of going to the moon was simpler and safer versus the current Artemis approach of going to the moon?
What I would say about the Apollo approach is that it was simpler. I wouldn't say it was necessarily safer. That will, we'll know that after we're done. But I think that our current approach has a lot of potential to be actually safer than Apollo. Even because of the flexibility and complexity, we can actually increase some of the safety aspects.
Mr. Cooke, in the time that I have remaining, do you have any additional comments you would like to give on this subject?
Just that it gets back to probabilities in the end and critical events, critical launches, and the more that you have, the higher the risk. We did succeed with Space Station, which was about 40 shuttle launches to build. Had we lost a payload during that time, we didn't have backups. We didn't have the margin and budget to have backup hardware. So if we had lost one of those payloads, we would have been scrambling. So it's better to keep it simple. It's hard enough as it is. If you watch the documentaries from Apollo 11 and saw the team in the control room, who I grew up under at Johnson Space Center, you saw their anticipation of every burn, every docking, every possible critical operation. You saw their anxiety leading up to that point and the relief when it was done. So the fewer that you have like that, the better you are, I think, and less risk.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and appreciate everybody's testimony today. Thank you very much for being here. Ms. Chaplain knows where I'm going with my line of questioning, and it really is pretty simple. And my goal is that we get to Mars by 2033. And there are a whole variety of things that can happen, different ways to do it, and I'm not a technician, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, and I rely particularly on you two gentlemen and all of the people that are working on this to figure out the best way to do it. And if going to the moon first is a great stepping stone to ultimately get to Mars, that's what I want to do. Ms. Chaplain knows my job is to help find the money to get this done, which is not that easy, but obviously is a key component to all of this. So my question to all three of you is, have we lost sight of, in this process of Artemis and getting to the moon, have we lost sight of what I hope is the ultimate goal of getting our astronauts on Mars 2033? Mr. Bowersox.
Sir, first, thanks for showing us the bumper sticker.
Oh, yeah,
And
put it right there.
I love to see your excitement, and I share it. I want you to know that. And I want to assure you that the Artemis program is part of our Moon to Mars effort, and we have worked really hard to keep the horizon goal of Mars in sight in all of our integrated planning.
Ms. Chaplain, since you get to kind of watch this from the money side.
Right. It would have been a challenge, even without this focus on Moon right now, to get to Mars, if that's all we focused on. It's going to be a big challenge to get to the Moon again by 2024. That leaves you 9 years left to get to Mars. I think it's still very challenging, even if you had, as you desire, unconstrained amounts of funding to get her. That would help.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yes,
Thank you.
but it's still going to be a challenge. It's worth trying, but it's a challenge.
No, and I think you and I have had this conversation. I mean, this is a big challenge. This is a huge task. This is difficult, to say the least. But there are ways to do it, and I think we have the capability. And as you and I have talked about, this is going to be, in my hope is it's NASA-driven, it's public-private, and it's international in scope, so that there are others assisting in partnership with us getting to Mars. But my job is to work with you and our appropriators to make sure the funding is available as the technology develops and the plans develop. Mr. Cooke, please.
Yes, I'm fully on board with getting to Mars, and think that for the reasons I stated earlier, the moon is an important step and helps force the technologies and and the operational capabilities to do that. In fact, I talked about deferring the gateway for the first lunar lander, but a gateway, in my view, could be the prototype for a Mars transit vehicle. And if you did it that way, tested out those technologies and life support systems, the power and propulsion element that's a part of it now is high efficiency propulsion for in space. Those kind of things, if they're tested out right and thought out and not hurried, they can end up being prototypes for the mission, for the actual in-flight mission to Mars. So I think it fits together, but it takes putting together a long-term plan so that you see where each of these aspects fits in the big scheme of things.
Okay. Thank you all. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter. I realize I should have said I recognize Mr. Perlmutter and his bumper sticker. We knew that was coming. The chair recognizes Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for coming and sharing with us today. Previous IG and GAO reports have indicated there have been some issues with the exploration ground system software. I wonder if you could update me on the status of that. Mr. Bowersox first.
The latest I'm hearing is that we're getting through those issues, and we should be on track to meet whatever earliest Artemis 1 date we can get. When we can get the stage there, the ground system's going to be ready, is what I'm hearing.
Anyone else want to comment?
I'd say just generally the delays being experienced on the hardware side has given the software side more time to work out their issues. The hardest part is always on the ground system side that is at Kennedy, because they have to respond to any changing requirements from Orion and SLS. So to the extent that there's still some changes going on, there'll always be some changes going on the software side.
Okay, thank you. Following up on a question of Mr. Chris previously asked about the second mobile launch platform, why did it take so long to issue a contract for that?
I'll get back to you on details on that one, sir. I'm not exactly sure. That was a little before my time, but I know we're underway right now and planning to start construction at the end of the year.
You know, has the delay of construction prevent SLS from complying with the NASA authorization requirements to reach a 130-ton launch capacity?
I wouldn't say that delay is going to interfere with reaching that particular goal. There's probably other complexities that might delay us from getting to that goal, but it is still our eventual goal at around Artemis 9 or 10.
Okay. How confident are you that we'll have boots on the moon by 2024?
How confident? Well, I wouldn't bet my oldest child's upcoming birthday present or anything like that. But what I'll tell you is having that aggressive goal is really good for us. It is helping us focus. It's helping us keep track of what's important inside our agency. And so we're working towards it as hard as we can. And I think it's healthy for our whole organization.
Do you think we'll make it?
Well, we're going to do our best to make it. But like I said, what's important is that we launch when we're ready, that we have a successful mission when it launches. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that just arbitrarily we're going to make it. We have to have a lot of things come together to make it happen. We have to get our funding. We have to balance our resources with our requirements. And then we've got to execute it really well. And so there's a lot of risk to making the date, but we want to try to do it.
Okay. Mr. Cooke, what do you think? Where are you placing your bets?
I would agree with Ken on what he said. I think it's important to have the urgency in the program to get things done. These programs require constant problem solving, and there's a way to go to get to the moon based on the things that have to be done. But the sense of urgency is important in programs, so that it's not business as usual. You're working off problems. But I support getting to the moon as soon as possible. I don't have insight into the exact program schedules and details, but so I couldn't honestly say, but I support getting there as quickly as possible.
Okay. Ms. Chaplain?
Yeah, I also agree that having aspirational goals is good. It's still a lot of risk in getting there. You're having to manage a lot of programs that need a lot of new development within a short period of time. But to manage things like that, there are some things you can do, like having a very detailed architecture to help you manage all that overlap that you're going to be experiencing. Having good configuration management, so when changes are introduced, people can really weigh the cost of those changes and the effects they have and understand the implications that they have. Having good visibility into progress and being very open and transparent is very necessary so that you guys understand what's ahead and maybe what more resources are needed. And then having very good communication lines within the agency and with contractors is important.
All right. What do you think the odds are commercial will beat you? Mr. Bowersox?
The odds that commercial will beat us to the moon?
Yeah.
I'd still bet on us,
All right.
but they might be part of our program.
Mr. Cooke?
I agree with that answer. I believe that the program that was laid out for going to the moon is the best chance of getting there, and to do it as simply as possible will get us there the quickest. There is a role for commercial in this. I don't know that anybody can beat the government program because of its capabilities.
Okay. I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Olson, although she wonders, she has to wonder if he was so scared of OU beating Texas that drove him to retirement in the intervening time.
I thank the chair. And I have to say congratulations, my dear friend. Your Sooners, 49. Our Houston Cougars, 31. Great victory. Great victory. But I'd like to point out that never, ever would have happened without a native Texan, your quarterback from Brian Babin's district, Jalen Hurts. And as my dear friend knows, there's this big game called the Red River Rivalry. Hook 'em Horns beat Oklahoma.
You notice which school he chose.
He made some mistakes. Went to Alabama first. Thank you, Mr. Bowersox, for talking about the focus at NASA and Johnson Space Center. I moved there in the summer of 1972. Apollo 16 had come home. Apollo 17 was the last mission to fly that December. I saw the excitement, the focus, and then we hit the 1970s. Just nothing of importance. 3 Skylab missions, Apollo, Soyuz, just nothing, kind of this lack of focus, malaise, flying the space shuttle, building the space station, all the focus again, constellations wiped out, no focus. Then we're going back to the moon, more focus. And so as you guys said, I think that's right mission for us. My concern is we built the Saturn V rocket for one mission, to take 3 people in a craft that can land on the moon to the moon and bring them back. The SLS was made out of a concept of going back to deep space, not a mission per se at the time to take it there. So my question is, has there been challenges molding that rocket to the ever-changing Mars, moon, whatever missions? Is it on track? A challenge we can help out with? Because I know it's tough. Apollo was very clear. Moon, 3 men come back. This one, Mars, moon, deep space. Any concerns there?
Well, you're pointing out a really good problem. And that is, if you change your approach too often, then the whole process can become muddled and it can make it difficult to get where you're going. I think that's something that you guys can help us with, is consistency of direction and help us maintain a consistent approach. And that will give us a much better likelihood of reaching our horizon goal of Mars with the moon to develop that capability.
Thank you. And then I got to focus on the Johnson Space Center because that's by my home. And this question is both you again, Mr. Bowersox, and Mr. Cooke. What role should JSC have in astronaut training and mission operations for things like Gateway and Lunar Lander? How do these lunar landers, how are they being taken care of at the same stringency as the Apollo missions? Because that expertise, while fading, is still by the Johnson Space Center. And now it looks like that may be going to Marshall. So my question is, are you satisfied? Can we help get this right? Because I think we have the expertise there for the landers, the gateway.
Well, first of all, one of the things we try to do at the agency is balance out our activity across all of our centers so we can take advantage of the best at each center. And we thought that for the human landing system, Marshall's specialty in propulsion would really help them in the management of that program, since a big part of that whole landing system is the propulsion system. But I want to assure you, the Johnson Space Center folks, especially the folks in flight operations, mission control, the astronauts, will be heavily involved in developing all the crew interfaces that will be required to operate the vehicle. They're going to be critical working with Marshall to get that vehicle done so that it's successful.
Mr. Cooke, any comments to that, sir?
I totally agree with what Ken is saying. I think the Center for Human Spaceflight Mission Operations is in Houston. It needs to keep focus on what's coming and prepare for it. I think the capabilities are still there.
Final question to you, Mr. Bowersox. After we develop the Sls and Orion, NASA will transition to their contracts for operations to the private sector. Does this reduce costs? And how do you expect to see those reductions in the contracts coming after that? Is it a viable program? That's my question.
Well, part of the idea of increasing the amount of programs we do commercially is to get more fixed price contracts and get more competitive incentives to help reduce the costs. I mean, that's one of the things we're trying to do so that we can do more with the resources that we have. But we still have to prove that that's really going to occur, right? There's still some risk that it won't. But we're seeing positive signs with our commercial cargo providers.
And those are my questions. I just want to get the chairwoman involved in a current endeavor we all support. I'm sure you do, Mr. Bowersox. Go Navy! Beat Army! I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
As you can tell, we don't have any fun on this committee either. The chair recognizes Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And as a 23-year veteran, I have to say, go Army, be Navy. It's bipartisan. Hey, Mr. Bowersox and Mr. Cooke and Ms. Chaplain, I just have to take a step back, and I know you just had questions along these lines from Mr. Olson. I get asked by Floridians all the time where space is really in our DNA, and folks follow this very closely down in my district in Northeast Florida. I was asked by a constituent the other day why NASA can't go over there in Space Museum and dust that lunar lander off, upgrade that thing, and get it back on the SLS that you're rebuilding, and let's go. And we laugh, and that obviously skips over a lot of technical details, but it does get to the heart of the issue of why a lot of Americans and a lot of Floridians struggle to understand why it feels like we are inventing the wheel. We did this a long time ago with a lot less technology, and so as someone who's new to this committee, I cringe when I hear it's going to take us another 6 years to develop a spacesuit, or that we're talking decades to get back to where we were decades ago. So can you kind of just elevate a little bit? Because I think all of us in this committee and all of us who care about space exploration are going to continue to make the case and have to make the case of not why this is worth the funding, but why it is taking so much time and so much effort and so many delays and so much money, frankly, to get back to where we were.
Well, first, that's a great question, and it's something that I think about every day. I think we've done it before. Why is it so hard to do it again? And one of the things I see is we do things differently now, and often we want to take less risk. And that is one of the biggest challenges we've got. So I keep trying to get people to go back and look at what we actually did on the lunar module for Apollo. What did we do with the suits back then?
From a process-wise
From a
and
process
a culture
point of view and a culture point of view, to help remind us of the type of risks that we accepted in the past, and to see if it's appropriate to inform our risk decisions in the future.
Go ahead, Mr. Cooke, and
It's really a complicated question and answer, I think. There are a lot of facets to it. You're absolutely right, it was done, and a lot of those technologies were proven. Some of them have been abandoned for a long time. We found when we made the decision on SLS propulsion that a great answer for propulsion on a launch vehicle from Earth is a big kerosene engine, which we had on the Saturn V. But we haven't done a big kerosene engine since then. The shuttle was LOX hydrogen, and that drove us to go that direction. So we can walk away from capabilities that take some time to get back. Now, on the other hand, it shouldn't really take all that long to develop some of these things. I am fully on board with getting them done as quickly as possible, and actually, if you have some urgency, it keeps alternate ideas and new requirements from creeping in, which is part of the reason it does take longer. Because
you're talking about the great idea factory.
Yeah, the great ideas.
That we call in the Army.
So we because we have more capability and technology, we want to fit them in somehow. I mean, it's typical for an engineer to want to make things better. So we get trapped in that to some degree, I think.
So just in the interest of time, what I really want to get to, and the chairwoman mentioned it. What do you think NASA needs from the Congress and the administration, particularly as this committee works towards a reauthorization, to meet our goals of getting on the moon? I know we have the broad agency announcement out for a commercial human landing center. We've discussed in the terms of the committee has discussed in the context of Artemis that NASA plans to award contracts at least one provider that can safely deliver humans to the moon annually, beginning in '24. What do we need? What do we need to get done this year, short and medium term, to hit that goal?
Well, first, we appreciate your support, and we know we've got it. Consistent guidance and the resources. And for this year, what we need is that budget amendment so we can get the landing systems awarded, get those contracts out, because that's our long pole right now for getting to the lunar surface.
And what would you say is the drop-dead date? Well, let me use a better term. What would you say is the outside window of the date to get that contract actually awarded?
Well, roughly the end of the year. And then, it slips after we go past the end of the year is what I'd say.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz. The chair recognizes Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to sit in here and audit your class. I've learned more about football today than I thought I'd ever know. Mr. Cooke, I know you were at NASA for a few years during the Obama administration when Lori Garver served as deputy administrator. I would remind the committee that Ms. Garver is one of the architects of the policies that actually terminated the Space Shuttle and the follow-on Constellation program, which wound up resulting in our dependence on the Russians for access to the International Space Station since 2011, almost a decade now. Ms. Cooke, she has penned an op-ed, Ms. Garver has, on July 18th, 2019, about NASA's purview, in her opinion. Have you read that article by chance?
I don't recall it right.
Okay. Well, she read it's 2 days before the Apollo 11 anniversary, where she advocates actually for the termination of NASA's human exploration programs and the return to the moon, which she calls, quote, meaningless new goals, end quote, and said NASA should instead be turned into an agency to study global warming. And you've not read that article. It's Washington Post, July 18th, 2019.
I did read it. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't remember it.
Becoming a bit more familiar, sounding a bit more familiar now. Based on your experience, you've been around a long time, 45 years, as I read your bio in the space program. Based on that experience, does it surprise you that she would be advocating against NASA's human spaceflight programs and to focus NASA basically on global warming research at the expense of the space program?
I don't want to get into differences, you know, of that nature necessarily, but it doesn't really surprise me. I obviously
That's fair enough.
I feel differently.
Sure,
Obviously.
obviously, and I appreciate that. Do you perceive any danger of that actually happening?
I honestly don't know. I think that you all in Congress have kept us on a course in human exploration for a long time and have been the conscience of various ideas that have floated in and out. I know that while I was an associate administrator and had the Constellation program
Right.
at that time.
I read that.
And it was Congress that led us to where we are today with the Space Launch System in Orion.
Absolutely. Let me follow up with that with Mr. Bowersox in an exchange. Congressman Wall said he cringes when he thinks that it takes 6 years to build a spacesuit. So, Mr. Bowersox, as NASA is preparing for a crewed lunar landing and a pressing need to upgrade the extravehicular mobility unit, spacesuits used for ISS spacewalks, they need to be upgraded as well. How will NASA prioritize each of those efforts if they have a constrained budget environment?
Well, the good thing is they sort of go together. The way we've got the program set up now, the components we develop that can be used on the lunar surface can also be used at the ISS, and we would test them at the ISS first, at the station first.
But should it take 6 years, really?
You know, there's a certain amount of time that things take in the aerospace world, and 4 to 6 years seems to be about what you get, no matter how much money you throw at it. I would like it to be faster, and we're looking for ways to be faster.
Okay. Are there roadblocks along the way that you can identify, or is that just it? It takes 4 to 6 years, and you're just resigned to it taking 4 to 6 years. So, is there anything we can do to shorten that time frame?
I think you guys are giving us plenty of support, and we appreciate it. I think our folks at JSC have been working on it plenty of years now, and so with the right resources, I think we might be able to accelerate it some.
Okay. Do you know where we are currently in that timeline?
Yes, sir. Right now, we'll have the suits developed and tested in time for an Artemis lunar landing, and a test on ISS somewhere between now and then.
So that's a long way of saying we're somewhere between now and then.
Yeah, so roughly 5.5 years from now.
Okay. Mr. Posey posed the question about the 130-ton capacity SLS. How many with all the equipment that we would have to move up for the lunar the moon to be deposited up there and work, how many trips will that take? Any idea?
With our current plan, it would take one launch of the SLS with the Orion. The crew would go up, but prior to that launch, we'd position the stages for the lander, which could be somewhere between 2 and 3, and then depending on what we need for additional supplies, we might have an additional mission, so somewhere between 3 and 4 small launches.
Will that be the prototype to also go to Mars? And what's the gravity difference between Mars and the moon? Do you know offhand?
Mars is roughly 4/10 of the gravity on Earth. The moon's roughly 1/6
Right.
the gravity
Okay.
of Earth. For Mars, we would probably see similar type of launch rates, but very likely with the bigger vehicles, with
Right.
whatever large cargo vehicles are available.
And I know I'm over time, but one last question. You spent 200-something days on ISS?
Well, only about 150 some on
Not that you were
ISS.
counting.
Yeah.
So we're now
I would have
talking,
liked to stay longer.
so now we're talking about a trip to Mars that takes how many days?
Well, in some of our estimates, it could be 3 years.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you're here auditing the class. Always appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I have a few more questions. We're going to go through one more round because I think that it's pretty clear based on the questions that we've seen on both sides that there's some outstanding issues, and I want to touch on a couple more things before we wrap this up. So starting off, I think there's some clarity. I share many of the concerns with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle about heavy lift, and Mr. Cooke, I read the same article and have many of the questions. So I want to very clearly ask you, Mr. Bowersox, is NASA requiring the use of commercial vehicles to launch the lunar landing system? You said you wanted options, but I want to be clear, I'm understanding these as requirements, so can you clarify that for me?
That's what's in our plan, is that we're going to use commercial landing systems to launch the rockets.
Okay, so NASA is requiring, which is not the same as having options. It's a requirement in this plan.
It's a requirement in the HLS, but, I mean, we should be careful about what our definition of commercial systems are. There's lots of different rockets out there. We don't even know what is going to be developed in the future. So it's hard to say exactly which rocket will launch our landing systems. And we're open to options. We just want to make sure that there's some competitive pressure, and we'd like our providers to get their launch vehicle commercially.
I'm going to let you say something. I'm going to respond very quickly that I think, just to be clear, there is no commercial launch vehicle that is capable of launching or has demonstrated launch capability for the 15 megatons right now, which is the minimum of one.
We don't have a vehicle that has actually demonstrated that capability, but we've got multiples in development.
Okay. And Mr. Cooke, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
In talking about competition for vehicles, currently the SLS cannot compete, probably legally, because it's a government system. It is integrated by the government. The requirements are driven in the government, and there are different contracts. There's the core stages, which has been talked about a lot. There's also the Northrop Grumman boosters. There are also the rocket engines, the main engines. They're all different contracts. As a government-owned and operated program, I don't think legally it can compete if it's to be a competition.
Thank you. That was an important clarification. And I have many more follow-ups on that. We're talking about the heavy lift needs and capabilities. And Mr. Cooke, I'd love to hear a little bit more on that point, because if we're talking about a human, I agree, a schedule and goals that are lofty are important, and we've also seen some of the challenges in the lack of certainty when we've gone back and forth, and I think that's what we're working on, is to build certainty into this as much as we can, because there's a lot of unknowns unknowns that we're going to discover as we do the hard things moving forward. And it seems clear to me that there is a need for a heavy lift launch vehicle, and there is a vast distance between what SLS has been planned for and the heavy lift portion of that and some of these others. So I think my question to you, Mr. Cooke, is what difference that would make practically in breaking it up. I know we've talked about risk and in having a more integrated system in our pathway to the moon, using to Mars, using the moon as an interim step.
I think it's very important that you be able to launch as much integrated hardware as you can without having to assemble it, which brings on complications. It potentially creates heavier interfaces between them. When you join two pieces of space hardware, they are berthed or docked, and they have connections. They have fluid transfers. If you can integrate that on the ground and have it tested, it's much simpler than trying to put it together in space, which will require an incredible amount of analysis and planning operationally, and risk in it actually happening correctly. So being able to launch an integrated lander all at once is a simpler, more straightforward approach, and it provides more. Having the larger volume and mass capability allows it to be the size it needs to be for transporting the various elements that will go to the moon, not just the ascent vehicle, but also habitats. Another thing is going to a small lander, because of the constraints currently placed on having it launch on a commercial launch vehicle, may drive the fuel that's used on the lander to be storable, like what we call hypergolic fuels, that are different than fuels that you might use that you get from the moon. There's hydrogen and oxygen on the moon in the form of ice, we think, in the craters and at the poles. And if you're using storable fuels on your lander, that's one less place you can bring that to bear, and I think diminishes the possibility of commercial development at the moon.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And adding on, I've got a couple more follow-ups, and then I think we have just one more individual that wants to ask a second round of questions. Following up on that, I would just like to reiterate that the analysis about cost and benefit, I believe that there is value in developing commercial capabilities. There is absolutely a space for it. We've seen it in so many other places. And I am concerned that the decisions are not being driven by what is most efficient or effective and what is most cost efficient. And to reiterate that seeing those analyses from NASA and having the assurance that NASA is going to respond to the GAO request and to follow these procedures is critical. This is an investment of our taxpayer dollars, and we are all, I think, on this committee on board in understanding the need for us to help set course that can be followed and prevent some of the stops and starts, and to advocating for sufficient funding. And it's very difficult for us to do that if we don't know what the cost analysis is, if we don't have transparency, if we don't see that the analysis has been done, if there is a decision that has been made that is not based on the most clear path. We know part of this is risky, and strapping people to rockets and sending them out of Earth's orbit is always going to be risky. And it's also an endeavor worth undertaking. And as the committee with responsibility for oversight and authorization, it's also incumbent upon us to ensure that our taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely and that our investments as a nation are being guided. And so what we need to see is an analysis of this, why these decisions were being made, what is driving them, because options are important, and if there is not an analysis to back it up, why are these decisions being made? So we can set this up for success. Ms. Chaplain's report really shows many of these things, and it's not to undermine NASA. In fact, I think it's to support our human exploration program, that we need full visibility on these decisions so that we can better advocate and educate the public and our colleagues about what is happening and what it's going to take to get this done. And so to that end, one more question I think is important, Mr. Bowersox, because you have mentioned this a couple of times, that decisions won't be made until a new deputy administrator or associate administrator, is selected. So my question is, has NASA identified finalists? How close are we? Because working on type timelines is impacted by the lack of an individual who can make those critical decisions. So where is NASA in that process?
Well, at first I want to reassure you, we're working tactically every day to make the decisions that need to be made and moving forward on anything that could compromise our 2024 date. And NASA, I'm not handling the selection. It's being handled by our 9th floor A suite. They're working really hard talking to candidates, and I think they've got a goal to actually be through with that process by the end of the year. And it's hard work, and we want to give them all the time they need because we want them to find the right candidate, right? We could be in a lot worse situation if we got the wrong candidate into the job.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hill, you're recognized.
Thank you so much. Mr. Bowersox, just wanted to follow up on a letter that the OIG sent indicating that NASA will use the first 3 SLS flights for the Artemis missions, and as a result, could not have an SLS available for the Europa Clipper until at least 2025. Is that accurate?
Right now, we think that's accurate.
Okay. What's the status of development of the cargo variant of the SLS payload fairing that would be used by Europa Clipper?
Well, right now, by law, there's certain work that we have to provide to launch Clipper, and so we have a cargo fairing for Clipper in work. And as part of the negotiations for this follow-on core contract that we talked about earlier, from 3 through 12, we're hoping that we can get to the flight rate where we would actually be able to provide an SLS to launch Clipper. But again, that requires performance that we haven't seen.
So NASA stated that it's aiming for an SLS launch cadence of approximately 1 per year. What, if anything, would prevent launching more than 1 SLS in a year? And how much would it cost to produce an additional SLS flight unit?
Well, most of the costs that go into a vehicle like that are sort of fixed costs. The marginal costs are much less. I probably shouldn't quote a number, but it's a lot less than what we would spend for each individual year. And because it's under negotiation in the contract, I don't want to give that number. But we could do it for less to do that extra core. And it's a challenge that our team is looking at and would like to be able to provide that core for Clipper.
So you think it's possible to do an additional 1 per year?
I'm not ruling it out right now, but we have to see performance that we haven't seen yet, so I don't want to promise it to you.
Okay. And then switching gears for a second. So we talked about the how some of the delays have to do with being willing to take less risk than we did previously. And I know at least some of that is risk to human life. We've talked about that with the spacesuits. And so what I want to talk about ISS and what we've learned on the International Space Station over the last 19 years that enable us to more safely send astronauts to operate for longer periods of time in deep space. What more can we gain from additional year-long missions or other human research testing on ISS to prepare for these missions? And generally speaking, is that an asset that we will face, problems from losing with it, with lack of access to it?
Well, ISS is an integral part of our Moon to Mars strategy. I mean, everything fits together from the surface of the Earth out to the surface of the Moon and then out to Mars. What we need ISS for is to gather the data on how humans live in microgravity. Right now, the longest we've seen is roughly a year with a U.S. crew member, and we're talking about potentially 3-year missions to Mars. So we need that data. We need to see just what the risks are.
And would either of you like to respond as well?
The International Space Station was designed to do those things. It was designed to get us the data we need for long-term existence in space, improve technologies, and test hardware that we'll need for reliability.
I don't have additional comments.
Okay, I have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up, just generally?
Sure, the other stuff we want to do on the ISS is test the life support systems that we'd use to go to Mars. Those have to be super efficient and super reliable. The best place to test them is someplace close to Earth, and we're doing a lot of that at the International Space Station.
Great. Anything else you want to add on a subject not related to ISS?
I'd like to comment on what Chairman Horn was saying. In terms of going forward, you hear a lot of different alternatives, preferences that people have and reasons for having them. It really makes it important to develop a robust analysis of alternatives before you embark on these programs so that you do understand cost, schedule, performance, and the reasons why certain choices were made. We do have a study going on about that, like what are they looking at in terms of their analyses for the ways forward. So hopefully, by early next year, you'll see the results of that work.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hill, and thank you, Ms. Chaplain, for mentioning that. We look forward to seeing the results of that study. Bottom line, we're all trying to do the best, and I think the more information we have, we can for the agency, for our nation, for many different reasons, and the more information we have and the more clear it is, the better decisions that we can make. So I thank you for that and look forward to seeing that study. Before we bring the hearing to the close, I want to say thank you to all of our witnesses. I believe that, I hope that it's clear that we are determined and dedicated to asking the hard questions to make sure that we set NASA up for success and that we are being responsible to our taxpayers and to making sure that we're making the best decisions possible, and we really appreciate your expertise. I also want to say that the record will remain open for 2 weeks following this, and we are likely to follow up with some written excuse me, with some written questions for the record for each of you. Again, thank you to the witnesses, thank you to everyone who's here, and to the other committee members for your participation, and we're now adjourned.
I read